Nostalgia can slam you, although it may be better to say that nostalgia can spin attack you. The story embedded within games is not always necessarily connected to the direct narrative of the game itself, but to what exists outside of the game. That is what I'm going to talk about today. The Crash Bandicoot series of games, specifically the first three, show the development of early 3D games and how the story of game development can be told through the games themselves. As every new era in gaming comes and goes, we see that certain trends rise and fall. For instance, in FPS history, there was a time in which everything wanted to be like the modern warfare games, and that was followed by everything trying to be a hero shooter. But what about something more primal, more deeply embedded within the actual technology of games? This is where you get something like Crash Bandicoot. The video on display is from the remake versions released in 2017. But aside from making them more visually appealing, the games themselves remain generally true to form, including in the ways that they have aged most drastically. In Crash Bandicoot, you will find a cavalcade of old-fashioned ideas that needed to be tested to determine whether or not they would succeed or fail, and many of them failed. The first of these games was released in 1996, and that was incredibly early in the days of 3D gameplay. Firstly, the game, as a platformer, drew inspiration from earlier 2D platformers, and certain concepts are retained from that period and style. For instance, the idea of only having one hit point unless you get a power-up that gives you an extra hit or two, and this means that you die very easily in the game. All it takes is one hit. As games have developed, that level of instantaneousness has been generally replaced by hit points or a health bar, as well as enemies who usually need to directly attack you before you lose some of that health. This goes hand in hand with the old-fashioned lives system, which can be found in home releases of 2D platformers that preceded Crash Bandicoot, and so they needed to be retained. Most games of this nature have since done away with that mechanic, aside from, games that'll try and have a very specific nostalgic bend to them. However, we have learned that you can make a game challenging without the artificiality of a lives system. When it comes to artificiality and the relation of the Crash Bandicoot games to earlier platformers, the constrained perspective is a perfect example of it. While something like Spyro, which first came out 2 years after the first Crash Bandicoot game, truly embraced 3D and used fully realized 3D worlds for the player to explore, Crash Bandicoot, on the other hand, used 3D to create a tight rendition of what is essentially a 2D platformer map. Every standard platformer level in the game feels fundamentally old in its design because of how tight everything is. You can run from side to side, but there is not as much purpose in doing so with something this constrained. That level of constraint fundamentally limits the way in which the player is able to move. As platformers continue to tackle 3D, they would move away from this kind of restraint and into a more open design. In many later 3D games, even when a game was designed as a set of linear levels, the way in which you progress through it is generally more open. However, the fact that Crash Bandicoot feels so dated in these respects is proof that it was at the very forefront of 3D technology in gaming. Does everything work? No. Was everything meant to work? No. It was meant to show what stuck and was worth keeping, and what did not stick and needed to be chucked. This proceeds into some of the other things that are done in these early 3D platformers. Other than the limited movement and dedication to outdated 2D concepts, there is also a willingness to wantonly experiment. For instance, having sections in which you drive an unwieldy vehicle or animal like a bike, bear, or tiger through a level that was not particularly optimized for it. However, it was trying something new and different. The same goes for the sections in which you fly a plane, submarine, or boat, complete with pointless if cutesy tricks you could pull. They were throwing whatever they could to the wall to see what stuck. What did stick? Well, kind of none of it. However, it's the attempt that truly counts, and perhaps the best encapsulation of Crash Bandicoot's dedication to experimentation with the 3D platformer genre can be found in the reverse shot sequences. Sometimes you run toward the camera rather than away from it in these games. You are usually being chased by something like a dinosaur or boulder and need to run toward the camera while jumping over and darting around the obstacles in your path. These are definitely the most dated sections of the remake of the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games. We have learned to never do this with 3D games because it takes away an advantage that you fundamentally have when you can see everything ahead of you. When humans perceive things, They see what is in front of them. They do not see what is behind them, so switching the camera to focus on the other direction, while seeming to be something that could be fun, considering the fact that films do it sometimes, is very much not fun. The reason we can have shots in movies in which characters run toward the camera is because the camera is independent of the vision of the actors/characters. They get to see things in the correct direction, we do not. And so shifting the camera in that way in a game mostly just causes it to be disorientating rather than enjoyable. However, I am glad that Vicarious Visions, the studio that worked on the remake, left those formal experiments in when creating the remake, even if they are old-fashioned and, thankfully, gone from contemporary game design. Through a series of games like Crash Bandicoot, you can see the story of game development through what is on screen. The devs wanted to experiment with the form and figure out what they could do with this new technology. They made missteps, but they made them so that others did not need to make them. Story in games is not only between the characters in the game itself, but also between the audience and the developers. They tell us their development story through the games that they give to us. So, listen to what they say through the decisions that they make about design, and you may just hear a story that exists on top of the story the game's characters are trying to tell.